Morning, everyone. Trust you had a wonderful night last night. So, as we said from last class, we wouldn't go into HTML anymore. Today's class would start with CSS. And like I said in the previous class, CSS is used for, styling and making the HTML document look more presentable. So that's what we'll be focusing on in today's class, from this class to other classes. So let's go and let's see the content we have for today's class. So the first concept for today's class is Introduction to CSS. So in this section, we'll get to know what CSS is. We'll also look into a little history about CSS because from some research I did before, I understood that CSS wasn't the only styling language, but eventually it was what was adopted to be the styling standard for the web. Also would also get to know why CSS is very important. So this is for the first part of today's class. For the second part, we would get to look into the methods of using CSS. So CSS has three different ways it can be applied to any HTML document. As we can see from the very first one is the inline CSS. We would also see the syntax of the inline CSS method. Second is the internal CSS. So that's another method of using CSS to style any HTML document. We would also see the syntax that comes with that method. And lastly, we would look into the external CSS method. Now, this method is like the most professional method. So probably this method is the most advisable to use according to normal coding standard. But we'd also look at the first two methods and also would look at the syntax of external CSS. Also, within external CSS, we'd look at the link elements because unlike the first two CSS method, the external CSS actually requires a particular element to link the style sheet file with the HTML document. So we'll look into that, the attributes of this element and everything surrounding it. So so this is the third section of today's class, how CSS works. So this is like the most important section and it's also going to be very practical. So at the end of this section, we would go into the actual coding to know how it works and how applicable CSS is with HTML. So under this section, we have the selectors. And as you can see, there are 6 different types of selectors in CSS. So from what I know, CSS is not limited to just these 6, but these are like the 6 major selectors. So any other selector under CSS comes under each of them. So here we can see the very first selector, the CSS Universal Selector. We'll also see what a selector is, before we go into the types of selectors. The second that we can see here is the CSS Element Selector. Then the third, the CSS Id Selector, followed by the CSS Class Selector, then the Css Group Selector, and lastly the Css Descendant Selector. So we'll look into each of these selectors, we'll see the syntax and we'll also apply them. That's when we get to the practical session after this presentation. So as you can see in the last part of this section is a quick demo on the workings of the different selectors. So that's the practical session we would have. It's like a quick demonstration on how each of these selectors work and their different syntax and how they all affect the HTML documents. So let's move. So back to the first section, we have it to be Introduction to CSS. What is CSS? So CSS is short for Cascading Style Sheet, and it's a style sheet language that is used to describe in specific details how HTML elements should appear on the screen when rendered by the browser. So this definition is quite explanatory because the CSS here describes in specific details. That means it actually goes in depth into explaining how a particular HTML element should look. It could describe the element's background, the color, the font size, different properties that are within that element. It describes them specifically how exactly they should look. So here with CSS, you get more precision in defining how you want a particular element to reflect when you view it on the browser, which is on the screen. So next we have brief history about CSS. So CSS was first introduced by Hakom William Lee on 10th of October 1994. Yeah, so that was when CSS was, introduced by this computer scientist. Also, we get to see that during the time when CSS was developed, other style sheet languages were actually proposed. So, as you can see, when CSS started, there were other styling languages that were also available by then. There were some competitions with CSS until the World Wide Web Consortium, that's W3C. Now, this W3C organization is an international standard organization for the World Wide Web. And the purpose of this organization is for the development of standards for the World Wide Web. That's for WWW, as we all know. So the World Wide Web Consortium eventually adopted CSS as its recommendation for web styling in 1996. So you can see that within 2 years, that was from 94 to 96, CSS and some other styling languages were all available, but eventually the W3C picked CSS as the standard for styling, and that is how it has been since 1996 even till today. So I hope we all got little knowledge about CSS before we dive into the real coding. So here we'll discuss why CSS is important. So as you can see from the first point, CSS provides more specific attributes, which gives you more power to define the look of a web page. So as I said before, CSS gives you this solid amount of precision. Now you get to have control over everything about the HTML element, because by using just HTML is quite limited to how you can present your information on the screen. But with CSS, you have more power to present it however you want it, whichever way, whether it is going to be on the left side or on the right side of the screen, or it's going to be with a large amount of text or a tiny text or the colors, background. You just have much more power to define the HTML elements the way you want it. It just gives you more power. So that's why CSS is very, very important. In the next point, we can see that without CSS, a web page that features only HTML will look very basic and unpresentable. So yes, for this point, this is quite true, because in the modern day we are in today, you would hardly see any website that is just built with HTML. In fact, all websites have CSS embedded in it one way or the other, because they just look so presentable, so nice. Some of these websites you visit, Facebook, Jumia, some organizational sites, school websites, what beautifies the website and makes it look structured is because of CSS. So without CSS, the website is going to look very, very basic. You won't probably like the UI. By that I mean the user interface, and also it won't look presentable. If you showed it to someone and probably a client who asked you to build a website and you just did it with HTML, trust me, it's not going to look nice at all. It's not going to look standard, and you know it won't be appreciated. So that's one of the reasons why CSS is very, very important. Now, usage of CSS is in line with the global web standards, unlike HTML, which has its attributes for styling to be deprecated. Yes, so I remembered I made mention of this point from last week's class when we learnt about HTML borders and HTML background. So I said that the HTML border and background attributes are not to be used. I only just explained it for the purpose of knowledge, but they are not to be applied in real projects because those attributes for styling are deprecated. By that we mean they are not acceptable anymore. They are no longer recognized. Yes, the attributes still work, but no, it shouldn't be used. It's no longer acceptable. So HTML purely is just used to build the skeleton of the website. So whatever thing you have to use to, beautify it, arrange it, make it look presentable is meant to be done with CSS. And usage of CSS is in line with the global standard. Like we said before, the World Wide Web Consortium actually recommended CSS as the web style for the web. So you can say that usage of CSS is in line with global web standards and not HTML anymore. So HTML is just to build the skeleton of the website. Just to HTML basically is just for the building blocks. Then the CSS is what makes those building blocks presentable. So that's one of the important reasons for CSS. And lastly, CSS saves a lot of time as it gives a user the ability to style multiple HTML pages concurrently. So by that I mean CSS gives you the ability to style different HTML documents at the same time simultaneously, in as much as each of those documents are linked to that CSL file. You would be able to style all of them at the same time. So that's one of the important reasons for CSS. So you can see why CSS is very important, to web styling and to the World Wide Web as a whole. So without wasting time, we are into the methods of using CSS. So here we'll be seeing the different methods of using CSS and their syntax. So CSS can be used to style HTML documents in three different methods, and these methods include the first method, which is the inline CSS method. Also, the second method, the internal CSS, and lastly, the third method, which is the external CSS. So in the next slide, we'll be looking at each of these methods that can be used, in styling HTML documents. Because trust me, each of them have their advantages and disadvantages. But like I said before, the last method, which is the external CSS method, is the most professional method to use. So let's dive into it. So first, we have the inline CSS method. Now, inline CSS is used when a user wants to style a single HTML element. Now, this inline CSS is one of the methods of styling in CSS, but then it doesn't really give you the power to style multiple elements at the same time. So this particular method majorly is for styling a single HTML element. So as we can see in the syntax below, that's the code in red ink. You can see it's a multi-tag and it also starts with the tag name. So Beside the tag name is the style attribute, which is the major attribute that CSS uses in this method. So this method actually uses the style attribute. So within the attribute, you would assign a property and a value. So that's how it is for inline CSS. But like I said before, it is only used to style a single HTML element. So if you probably want to style more than one HTML element at the same time, especially if they are similar, this method might not be the best method to use, except you want to style a particular and singular HTML element. Probably you want a styling for one particular element. Probably the styling format doesn't appear for any other element. That's when this method can be used. Because if you decide to use this method to style all your HTML elements, it's time consuming because you would need to apply the syntax into each of those elements. And trust me, by doing that, you would waste a lot of time. So that's why the next two CSS methods are quite better than this one. So let's look at the second CSS method. So as for the second method, we have it to be the internal CSS method. Now, this method allows a user to style multiple HTML elements using the style tags within the head section of the HTML document. Yes, so this particular method has an advantage over the previous method. Why is because this method lets you style multiple tags at the same time. Unlike the very first method, for you to do that, you need to apply the syntax into each of those elements, and it's time consuming. So, using this method would be at your advantage as it allows you to style multiple elements at the same time. But also, by using this method, you would apply a style element into the head element of the document. So, as we all know, the HTML document, that's in terms of the coding, it starts with the HTML tags. Now, within the tags are two sections, which are the head section and the body section. So, for most classes we've been having previously, you would notice that within the head section, we've had just the meta tags and the title tag, which is the name of the document. That's the name that would appear on the tab when rendered on the browser. So now also we should know that the head section of the HTML document, which holds the meta tags and the title tags, can also hold a style tag. And within that style tag, it will contain the elements we want to style and also the styling format. So that's how internal CSS works. It also works within the HTML document as inline CSS, but it's it isn't applied on the element. Rather, you would create a section for that styling within the head tags. That's the head section. So that's where the whole styling would be done for this method. So we'll be seeing that when we get to the practical session for this class. Yeah, so like I said earlier, the style tag is within the head tag. So this is a basic syntax of how it would look like on the editor. So as you can see, we have the HTML tag, which is the highest here in the hierarchy of tags, and every other tag comes within the HTML tag. Next, you have the head tag and the body tag. Now, for the sake of explaining internal CSS, I didn't add the meta tags and the title tags. So what you have here is just the style tags within the head section. That's the head opening tag and the head closing tag. So you have the style tags inside it, and you also have the selector. Now, I know many of us might not know what I mean by selector, but we'll get to know about that when we get to the third section. But basically, a selector is just like a representation of what you want to style. And also we can see the property and the value. So the property here, basically defines the actual thing you want to style within that element, and the value is, what exactly you want that element to look like. For instance, you can have a property of background, and for the value you can have it to be red, green, yellow. So the property is just what exactly you want to change about, that element, and then the value is the specific detail you want to add. So this is how the declaration is done for the HTML elements using this method. So you do it within the style tags, which would appear within the HTML element. The head element. So lastly, we have the external CSS method. So like I said, this is the most professional method to use, and that's because most developers don't like, the HTML document being clogged up with CSS styling. So this external CSS method requires a separate file for styling with CSS. So that's what actually makes this method better than the previous two methods, because now, rather than adding the styling format to your HTML document, you're going to have a special file that will be for styling. So that particular file will be dedicated for your styling. That's for the CSS styling. And how you would, connect it to the HTML will be through a kind of reference, that's using the link tag. So also, this method involves linking the CSS file with the HTML document using a link tag. Yeah, so as you can see, this method actually doesn't have the styling to be on the HTML document. The styling here is separate. So the HTML document is going to be on its own, .html file. Then the CSS styling would have its own standalone file separately. So you have a file that is dedicated for writing HTML. You have a file that is dedicated for writing CSS. So that file is what you would use for your styling throughout. And for you to link the CSS to the HTML, you would be making use of what is known as the link element or the link tag. So the link tag is like what connects your CSS document to your HTML. Now, many of us might not know understand about, the link tag, since I did explain this in previous classes, but here we'll be looking into the link tags and the attributes within the link tags that enables this connection between CSS and HTML. Yeah, so as you can see on the screen, this is how the syntax would look like. So this particular link tag also appears in the head section of the HTML document. By that, I mean it appears in the head tags, that's within the opening and the closing tag of the head section. So you can see it says the syntax is used for linking the .css file with the HTML page. So by .css, the .css here is the extension name. So just the same way you have your HTML to be the name that you assigned to it, then it ends with .html to show it's an HTML file. The file would also have, for CSS, would also have the name would declare, and then the .css to show that it's a CSS file. And here we would have this particular syntax to be within the head element as a way of connecting our CSS to our HTML document. So here we can see that the syntax has three attributes, which it isn't limited to, because there are much more attributes than the three of them within the link element. But then these three attributes are like the most important attributes. So at least with these three, you'll be able to connect your CSS to the HTML documents. So a quick note, this above syntax should appear within the head tags in the HTML document. Yeah. So as I said before, this particular syntax is going to appear within the head tags. So it's going to be in the section of your meta tags, your title tags, and also your style tag for those that might be using internal styling. But if you are not using internal styling and you're using the external CSS method, you would need to add this particular syntax within the head tag. Yeah, so like I said earlier, I said I was going to, describe the link elements and explain what each of these attributes actually do within the link tag. So within the link tag are three attributes, which are the rel attributes, the href attributes, and the type attributes. So like I said before, the link tag or the link element is not limited to these three attributes, but these three attributes are like the most basic attributes for the link tag, and in a way they are like the most important. So with these three you can actually go on to connect your css file to your html documents without any issue. So let's see what the three attributes are all about. So first we have the rel attributes. So I believe the rel attribute actually stands for relationship or relation. Yeah. So the rel attribute describes the relation between the current file and the file to be linked. Yes. So the rel attribute basically describes the relationship between the current file, that's the file that actually holds the tag, and also the file that is to be connected to the current file that holds this link tag. So it describes the relationship between these two files, like what is connecting this file with the other file, what is the connection that we have with this external file that it's outside. So going back to the syntax, you can see that within the link tag we have rel to be equals to style sheet, and style sheet is the default value for a css file, that's for this rel attribute. So this rel attribute actually tells the html document that, look, this particular file that is going to be linked to this document is meant for styling. That means it's a style sheet file. So that's what the rel attribute here is all about. So by default for CSS, the rel attribute is equals to style sheet. This actually describes the relationship between the HTML file and the CSS file. So it basically tells you that the file to be connected to the current file is actually for style sheeting. So that basically describes the whole purpose of CSS. So next we have the href attribute. So this attribute identifies the location of the linked file, that is the CSS file. Yeah, so as we can see here, the href attribute is actually similar to the source attribute that appears in the video element, audio element, and image element. That's from what we learned from the previous class. Yeah. So the href attribute also identifies the location of the linked file, like the way the source attribute identifies the location of images, videos, and audios to be used within that HTML document. But then the href isn't for video and audio. The href is for the particular file to be linked. So this is the attribute that tells the HTML file the location of the file that is, to be linked to the particular document. And if we go back and look at the syntax, we can see that the href here is not assigned anything. But then when we go into the actual coding, the href would be used to describe the actual, location of that CSS file that we want to link to the HTML file. So that's basically the function of the href attributes, to show the location of the CSS file. So lastly, we'll look into the type attributes. So I believe this is not the first time we are seeing these attributes, as this particular attribute has appeared in the label and also in the input tags under form, type. So this type attribute describes specifically the type of the file that is to be linked. So this attribute basically tells the HTML document the type of the file that's to be linked. So if it's a CSS file, it basically tells that okay, the file is of this type of CSS. If it's a JavaScript file, which we've not reached or we've not gone into yet, but then this particular attribute is used to describe the specific type of the different files to be linked to that HTML document. So let's see the syntax and see what we have there. Yeah, so from the syntax, you can see that the type attribute is assigned the value text slash CSS. So this particular value is the default value for the type attribute within the link tag for CSS. So the type attribute is assigned the value text slash CSS. Now, if we had a separate file that wanted to link to our HTML document but wasn't a CSS file, the type attribute for that would probably be type equals to text slash whatever the type of that file is. So probably if it's a JavaScript file, we would have text slash JavaScript or text slash any other file content that we want to link to this HTML document. So from this syntax, we can see that within the link element, we have two attributes that already have that, their default values. So these values do not change irrespective of the type of CSS file you are creating or the number of CSS file you are creating. This particular attributes, that's the rel attributes and the type attributes, they do not change at all. So this is how you are going to have it whenever you are using this particular method of styling. This method we are describing, which is the external CSS method. So that would mean that the only attribute within this tag that would change is the href attribute, which is the location of the file. So depending on where you put the file, how close it is to the HTML document is going to depend on what you would have within the href. So if you have the file, the CSS file and the HTML file to be within the same folder, you would only need to reference that by the name of the CSS file. But if you have it to be outside or in some other folders, you will need to go through all the directories. That means you need to list them out before you get to that CSS file. But like I said before, for easier understanding, it's always better you have the CSS and the HTML file in the same directory. So that way you would use the href attribute and you would just assign it the name of the CSS file and you wouldn't run into any issue. Yeah, so why I'm saying this is because from classes we've had before, I noticed that people had issues with, linking their video content, audio content, and image content. And I also said during those classes that we should always have those contents and the HTML document within the same folder. Yeah, because it's going to be very easy for you to, connect to that particular content. It's just better you have everything within the same folder and the same directory. So I believe we all understand what the link element is used for and the attributes that enable it to, connect the CSS to the HTML file. So let's move on. Yeah, so we have the syntax for the external CSS file. So this is the kind of syntax that would appear in the .css file that we would have. So now the CSS file, unlike the HTML, it doesn't have a boilerplate. You know, when we wanted to start HTML, we would need to start with the doc type element, then followed by the head element, which is the the major one. Then we'll divide it into two sections, which is the HTML element, which is the major one. Then within the HTML elements, we would have the head and the body. Within the head, we would have the meta tags, title, and then within the body, we would have the other elements that would display the content we want to be shown on the screen. But here in CSS, there are no boilerplates. There are no HTML or CSS declaration, nothing like that. So for the CSS file, you begin styling immediately without any boilerplate, without trying to declare any kind of elements there. But then some people might decide to start with comments, because having a lot of CSS um formats within a single file can be very, very clumsy. So using comments to describe a section of them would actually make your code more readable and more understandable. So we'll see more of that when we start you know coding in the practical session of this class. So let's move on. Yes, so now we are in the final section, which is how CSS works. Yeah. So like I said before, this is like one of the most important sections, because here we would understand how the CSS actually works, the selectors, the properties, and the value, how all these things are put in place to make the HTML elements look the way you want them. Yeah, so aside from inline method, the other method, that's the internal and external CSS, uses the following syntax. Yeah, so from the method we've seen in today's class, we've known that the inline method of styling is actually used to style a single HTML element, and by doing so, it has the syntax within the tag. But unlike the inline method, the internal and external CSS uses the syntax that you can see on the screen, which has the selector in curly braces, and within the curly braces we have the property and the value that is to be assigned to the particular property of that element. So for this section, we'll be looking into the selectors, because there are various types of selectors in CSS, and one of the most popular ones is the Css Element Selector, which is represented by the tag name itself. you know but then there are other ways of selecting HTML elements to be styled, and not just the tag name alone. So we'll be looking into all that too, and we'll have a practical demonstration of the various selectors. So this class is going to be quite practical. After this presentation, we are going to do a lot of practical on CSS. So we'll be making use of each of these methods. I would also be making use of each of these selectors, and we'll see how everything plays out on the CSS file. So yeah, selectors section. So we'll describe what a selector is, and the different types of selectors that we have in CSS. So first, the definition of CSS selectors. So CSS selectors are used to select the HTML element to be styled. Now this selection can be done via the class, the ID, or the element name. So from this explanation, you can see that selecting a HTML element to be styled isn't just going to be from the tag name, but then there are other ways to select it, which is the class name, the ID name, And would also see some other ways to select particular elements to be styled. In fact, some of these selectors even let you you know select different HTML elements at the same time. So we'd also see that too. So that way you would know that you don't need to just pick a particular element by its tag name. You could also pick several tag names of different elements and style them at the same time. So we'll be seeing that in the next slide. So yes, under selectors, there are different types of selectors, and they are the first selector here we have is the CSS Universal Selector. Secondly, we have the CSS Element Selector. Third, we have the CSS Id Selector. After that, we have the Css Class Selector, which is followed by the Css Group Selector. And lastly, we have the Css Descendant Selector. Yeah, so we'll be looking into each of these selectors, would know how they work and how their syntax would appear in CSS. Yeah, so for the very first selector, we have the CSS Universal Selector. So the Universal Selector selects all the elements in the HTML document and style them. Yeah, so by universal, it's like a generalized selector. That's this particular CSS Universal Selector. So the moment you use this selector, it's actually going to style every element within your HTML file. So that means whether it's a paragraph, a heading tag, probably if you assigned, you know, a property of styling um, a text font or adding a color to a particular text using this universal selector, irrespective of how the text appears, whether it appears with paragraph tag, heading tag, a small, a big, a bold, italicized tag, whatever the tag is, it's going to style everything and apply that property on all the tags. So as we can see here, we can see that the syntax starts with an asterisk. So the asterisk here actually depicts all, that's everything. So we also have within the syntax the property and the value. So by using this selector, whatever property you have that is assigned a value, it's going to affect every element within the document. So if you have this syntax and you probably put a property of background color equals to a particular type of color, you're going to have that color attached to every element, irrespective of how they appear. So that's how the CSS Universal Selector works. So next we have the CSS Element Selector. So the element selector selects a particular element by its tag name and styles it. Yeah, so this particular selector actually selects the element through the name of the actual tag. So probably if you want to style a p tag, for instance, you would actually select the tag name, which is p, and then you would use the syntax which has the property and the value. So whatever property you declare, you would assign it a value and it's going to affect that particular element. Now mind you, if you have multiple p tags within your HTML document and you use this element selector, it's going to affect every element that has the p tag. So by that, what I mean is if you have multiple paragraph elements, or probably the heading elements as we have them to be heading 1 to heading 6. So let's assume you have up to 4 heading 3 elements in your HTML documents and you just wanted to style one of those heading 3. Now using the element selector would not only affect the particular element you want to style, but it will also affect other heading 3 um elements. So this method is actually best used when you have a particular tag that doesn't occur again at all. That's when using the CSS element selector is best, because if you use this particular selector in cases where that particular tag occurs multiple times, it's going to affect you know the other tags that you don't want to style. So that's what the CSS element selector actually does. So it styles it by the tag name, which could occur in your document more than once. But for the sake of that kind of thing happening, this element selector is not advisable to use. So the next set of selectors we would see would be the best type of selectors to use in the case where you have multiple occurrences of a particular element and yet you want to style just one of them. Yeah, so next we have the CSS ID selector. So the ID selector actually selects the HTML element to be styled, but through an ID attribute. So I believe we all know what an ID attribute is, because we use that in the forms class. The ID attribute actually appears, in the input tag of the forms. So the ID attribute is what, gives you like a specific detail of the element that you actually want to style. So probably in the situation where you have multiple occurrences of the same element and yet you want to style one of them, that particular one you want to style will have an ID attribute. So that ID attribute is what would be used to, reference it in the CSS file for styling. So that way, when you style it using the ID attribute, it only affects that particular tag and not the other tags that occur with it. So as we can see from the syntax, the CSS ID selector starts with a hashtag. So you would have the hashtag first, then you have the ID name. So the ID name is going to be declared in the HTML document, that's within the elements tag. So you declare the ID attribute with a name. You would assign the ID attribute a name within the HTML document in the elements tag, and then you come back to your external CSS file to to declare the ID name to be styled with the hashtag. So mind you, these selectors that we are talking about here, they only affect the internal and the external CSS method. So this particular syntax does not have anything to do with the inline method at all. So I just want to give you all a quick reminder that these selectors we are learning about are mostly used within the internal CSS method and the external CSS method. So I hope we all understand this. So a quick note on the ID selector. The ID attribute always starts with a hashtag, yeah, like I said before, and then it's followed by the ID name. So that's the way you would have it in the .css file. You would have it starting with the hashtag, then followed by the ID name. After that, you would have the curly braces, and then you would declare the property you want to, you know, change, and then you assign that property a value. Yeah. So also the ID attribute is always unique, hence it is meant to be selected for a single and specific element. Yeah. So this is a very, very true statement. And I remembered from the form class, I talked about how important the ID attribute was. Yes. Because then when we treated forms, that's within the input tag, we had two tags which could actually, be used to declare the name of, the input, that's the ID and the name attributes. And I remember from that class, I made a very, very specific concern about the ID attribute and how it is a very, very special and unique attribute. No input tag can have, the same ID attribute name, but it can have the same name in the name attribute. I mean, the same value in the name attribute. So that's also how it is here in CSS. The ID attribute is also meant to have a very unique name. By this, I mean that the ID attribute cannot be assigned a value that is also repeated in another element. No. The ID attribute is always meant to be unique. So by using the ID attribute, you would always know that you are using it to style a particular tag that doesn't have that particular, ID name. So the ID attribute is meant to be assigned a value that doesn't appear in any other element. So that's what makes the ID attribute very unique. And like I said also, it's also selected for a single and specific element. So by doing this, you should know that when you decide to use the ID attribute to style a particular element, you shouldn't expect it to style, different elements. It's just meant to style one element. So you would have it to be one element per, ID name. You cannot have the ID name repeated in any other element, as the ID name is very unique for a particular element. So I hope we all understand this, and I also hope that we don't try to, declare the ID attribute with the same name in different elements. It isn't a proper, coding practice. It's not proper to do that. In the next slide, we would see a particular attribute that would give you the chance to do that kind of thing. But for the sake of this ID attribute, it's very unique. So if an element has an ID attribute that is assigned a name, it should always have that particular name within that element. You are not going to have that name in any other element. The ID attribute is just basically there to just style a single element only. It isn't used for multi-styling. It's what makes the element that has the attribute to be very unique. So in the next slide, we would see another attribute that gives you the chance to style multiple tags with the same class name. Yeah. Yeah. So next we have the CSS Class Selector. So the CSS Class Selector selects a HTML element via a class attribute. Yeah. So as we saw in the previous slide, which is the ID attribute, the ID attributes and the class attributes, they both work the same way. Only difference is that the ID attribute is meant to be unique, which means it cannot be repeated, you know, in another element once it has been declared in one element. But then the class attribute can actually be repeated in as many elements as you want. So this particular attribute actually gives you the power to style any element that has the same class names. You know, when you reference it by the class name in the CSS section, you actually get to style different elements in as much as they all have the class attributes and they are assigned the same name. So the syntax for the class attributes, as you can see, for this one, it starts with a full stop or a dot. Unlike the ID attribute which starts with a hashtag, this one starts with a full stop and then followed by the class name. So the class name is basically going to be the value that you would assign, that is going to be assigned to the class attribute. So then it's followed by the curly braces, and within the curly braces you have the property and the value. So that's basically how the class selector works. So a quick note, The class attributes always starts with a full stop. Yeah, so it starts with a dot. The dot here actually depicts that it's a class name, and the hashtag, as we learned from the previous slide, actually depicts that it is an ID name. So using the full stop and an ID name is not going to work. It has to be a class name. And using the hashtag with a class name will also not work. So to reference the element by the ID name, you must use a hashtag. And to reference the element by the class name, which is the section we are in now, you must use the dot or the full stop here. So after the full stop, what follows next is the class name, as we learned from the syntax. Also, the class attributes, unlike the ID attribute, can be repeated in different elements. Hence, it can be used to style multiple elements simultaneously. Yes. So, as you can see, you can understand the difference between the ID attributes and the class attributes, even when they perform the same kind of, function with CSS. The purpose of these attributes are quite different. So the ID attribute is meant to be unique. So if you are to use the ID attributes in different elements, each of each of those elements are going to have different ID names. So it does not matter how many tags you are trying to style. Probably if you have 4p tags and you choose to style the 4p tags using the ID attributes, what that basically means is that each of these p tags, which we also know as paragraph tags, each of them are going to have different ID names. So you are going to create an ID name for each of them, and the ID name is going to be unique in such a way that no other element shares that ID name with that element where it has been declared. So that's what makes the the ID attributes very unique. But unlike the class attributes, if you are to still take those paragraph tags, the four of them, and you are to style them with the class attributes, you could actually just declare the class attributes with the value in one of those tags, and then you can copy them in each of those other p tags, you know. And by doing so, you can actually style all of them together via the class name, because the class name appears in each of those tags. So once you reference the element by the class name, it's going to affect every element that has that particular class name. So you can see that the ID attribute doesn't give you that power to style, different elements at the same time. But unlike the class attribute, which is where we are now, the class attribute actually gives you the power to style, different tags with the class name. And by different tags, I mean any element that has that class name. So probably you have those four p tags with the same class name in each of their opening tags, and you also have a heading 2 tag or a heading 3 tag or a heading 4 tag, and you also put that class name within those heading tags. If you put that if you put the particular class name within those heading tags, that would actually mean that there are seven occurrences of the class attributes with the same name. That's four within the four paragraph tags and three within the heading 2, 3, 4 tags. Now by referencing the elements by the class name, whatever style you attach to that class name is going to affect those seven elements. So it's not just going to affect the p tags, but it's also going to affect the heading tags too. So that's what makes the class name actually different from the ID attributes. So the class attributes can be used to style different kind of tags in as much as they have the same class name. So if you have a paragraph tag, a heading tag, a link tag, and a tag, in as much as the class attributes with the name that is to be used is assigned to that attribute, you can actually style those different elements together at the same time. So I hope we all know how the class attributes actually works and how it is different from, the ID attributes, even when they seem to be performing the same function. Yes, but yet their purpose is different. So very soon when we dive into the practical session, I would, go through this again and I would show you a practical demonstration of how each of these selectors actually work. So you would see, you know, how everything goes down very soon. Yes, so the next selector we have is the CSS Group Selector. So this selector is quite unique because unlike the other selectors we've been going through, those other ones actually either use the tag name or the class ID or the class attributes or the ID attributes, and they are used to style specific type of tags, except for the class attributes that would style you'd be used to style different kind of tags. But then this particular selector also styles different type of tags but without a class name. So this particular selector, by using this selector, you don't need to repeat a particular class name within those different elements you want to style at the same time. So the group selector is used to select different elements that have the same styling format. Yeah. So like I said before in the previous selector, which is the class selector, I said if you have a group of paragraphs, probably four of them, and you have a group of heading, probably the three heading, which makes it seven elements combined. To style everything at the same time, you might need to attach, a class attribute to each of those tags, and you would also assign the same name to the class attributes there. But then the CSS group selector does not need to, go through all that process of adding the attributes in each of those groups. You can actually just pick one of those, tags to represent the four P tags, just one, and then you pick one of those heading tags to represent, the three headings we have. And so as you can see in the syntax, you can see the syntax has the tag name one, comma, tag name two. So this selector actually lets you style different elements in as much as the styling format is the same. You can actually select a P tag, comma, a heading one tag, then you keep going in that line, heading two. Any occurrence of that tag, you can keep adding them, and then you would assign it a property and a value. So the property and the value within this syntax will affect the number of tags that were listed, in the syntax. So if you have a P tag, a heading one tag, and a heading three tag, and each of these tags actually have the same styling format. So rather than repeating, having the P tag, rather than using the element selector, which would mean you would have the P tag with its own, you know, syntax, then you have the H1 with its own separate syntax, and then you have the H2 with its own separate syntax. Instead of doing that, the group selector actually lets you put the P tag, the heading 1 tag, and the heading 2 tag, and give these three elements a particular styling format which is the same, since it is the same for three of them. So using this, you don't need to have a separate syntax for each of these elements. You could just take the elements together and use one particular styling format that will affect these three elements. So that's why the group selector is very important. So let's see the last selector we have. Yeah, so as you can see, the last selector here is the CSS Descendant Selector. So the Descendant Selector is used to style a particular element that lies inside another particular element. Yes. So normally you might ask, since the HTML document is broken down into, separate sections whereby a particular element is under a particular element, you might ask, how does this work? Now, this works when a particular element is directly under another element. So, as we all know, there are some elements in HTML that have another element within itself by default. For instance, you have the OL and the UL tags, which is for ordered list and unordered list. Now, in each of these tags are the LI tags, which are for the actual listing. Also, when we treated tables in some previous class we also saw that within the table tag is the T head and the T body. Now, within the T head tag is the TR tag, which has the TH tags within, the TR tags. So those kinds of elements have some particular other elements that come inside them. That means that's how they appear by default. It's not something that we created and we decided to put a particular element within another. No, that's how they are, by default. So the table element has that's within the table head, that's in the table element, are the TR tags, which will have the table headers. And also within the T body, we have the TR tag, which will have the table data, table data tag, that's the TD tag. So those are some particular elements that are within, a certain element. Like I said before, the OL tag and the UL, which is ordered list and unordered list, have a specific type of tag within them, which is the LI tag. So this descendant selector is actually used to style those kind of, elements. So if we look at the syntax here looks similar to that of the group selector, which is the tag name 1, comma, the tag name 2. But then what makes it different is that for the tag name 1 in this case is going to have the element that is superior. So if we were to style a particular list, probably an unordered list that's within our HTML document, the tag name 1 would actually be represented by the UL, then the tag name 2 will be represented by LI, which is used for the actual listing. So if we were to do this using the tags within the table body, you would actually have the TR tag to be the first tag name, and then after that you have the following, the next tag, which is the TD tags, which is the second tag that is within the TR tag. So that's how this descendant selector works. So any particular element that has another element that is, within it, to style the one inside, you would need to go through the one outside. So that's why the descendant selector is also important. So to style the li tags, you would need to go through the overall tag, which could either be the ordered list, which is OL, or unordered list, which is the UL. So that's how it's done here in the CSS descendant selector. So yes, the moment we've all been waiting for. So here we'll have a quick demo on how the different selectors are used. So first off, I'm going to do a quick demo on the various methods of styling in CSS. So let's go to our Visual Studio. Yeah, so we are back to our VS Code. So I would be creating an HTML file and a CSS file in the same folder. So we have this folder CSS intro. I'll create an HTML file, index.html, and also would have a CSS file. So it's going to be the same process as creating the HTML file. Only difference would be that you would have the extension name to be in .css. So create this. Let's call it style.css. Yes. So here we'll be starting, the way we start off with HTML tag. Then we have the head. I'm doing this for the purpose of, those that have issues with using the boilerplate. So you can follow as I, carry along. Here would have the meta tag equals to UTF-8. Yeah, so this is the default, you know, encoding system for HTML. And also the title tag. CSS. Yeah. Yeah, so now we'll be showing an example of the very first method of using CSS, which is the inline method. So as we saw before, the inline method uses the style attribute within the HTML element. After that, you would declare the property and also the value. So let's start with a heading tag. CSS. So now to style this using the inline method, we are going to have the style attributes here. As you can see, we have it and it's ready to be assigned a value. So the value to be assigned to the style attribute is going to be a property and a value. By value I mean, the property and the value is the declaration of what you want to change. So the value for the style is the declaration itself. So I hope nobody is confused. So let's change the background color of the heading one. So select background color. Now I know in last week class we learnt about colors, the RGB format, the hex format, and the color name format. So anyone that is convenient for you, you can use it for this class. But then, like I said before, the RGB format and the hex format are used to get some precise and particular type of color. So for the sake of this, we'll just use the color name. Let's call this blue. Save this and open with live server. Yes, so you can see the background color of the heading one element on the screen is blue, and so it also spans, from left to right of the entire screen. So this is how the CSS actually works, using the inline method. So you could apply multiple stylings to this. So we can also have by the side text decoration. So this actually creates a kind of border around it, I think. Let's have this to be dotted. We save this and go back to our browser. Okay, it doesn't work for this element. Okay, let's try something else that works. Let's change the font size of the heading one. Font size is going to be 20, no, 15 pixels. So this is actually going to render a smaller text font than the default heading 1, because the heading 1 font size is actually a lot bigger. So this is actually going to look a lot smaller despite the fact that it is an heading 1 element. So if we save this and go back, now you can see that the font of the heading 1 looks even smaller than the default heading 1. So that's why I said CSS actually gives you the power to change any element the way you want it. So now each of these elements, they are, by default, they have static values, but CSS gives you the ability to change these values however you want it. So we can also change the type of font here. I think by default, most browsers uses the Times New Roman. So let's see another available font. That's font family. So for this, we are going to go with a font family that doesn't have Times New Roman. Let's use the first one. If we save this and go back to our browser, now you can see that the heading 1 font style actually changed. So now it isn't in the default Times New Roman. It uses the Courier font with the other family fonts attached to it. So that's what makes CSS very unique. You can change it however you want, however you desire. It just gives you the power to control every aspect of the HTML element. So going back to our VS Code, you can see that we've applied 3 different properties and we've assigned each of these properties 3 different values. But like I said before, the inline method isn't the best method to use. As you can see on the screen, you can see how long the styling is. So looking at this now, you know, our VS Code screen extends to outside what we can see. So we have to draw the slider. So using this method is not advisable because it makes it clumsy. Imagine we had to style another heading tag, probably a heading 2 tag or 3. Say heading 2. Let's have this to be CSS good and a heading 3. So if each of these 2 tags were to have the same property as the first, it would mean that we would need to copy all of this. Okay, my mouse. We save this and go back to our browser. So you would have it to look this way, you know, because we use the same styling with the very first heading. But then, like I said before, the inline method isn't the most advisable method to use except you want to style a particular element. And then you could also do that using the internal and CSS. I mean the internal and external CSS method. So you can see on our VS Code, you can see how clumsy everything looks. Having multiple inline styling within different elements would actually make your code look so shabby and clumsy and all. So it isn't advisable to use this method. So from what we learned in today's class, to actually repeat this styling for each of these heading tags, you would actually need to use a CSS Group Selector or a class name selector. So let's remove the styling now. Let's go through the other method of styling. I'm going to remove the styling for everything. Yes, so now we have pure HTML. If we save this, go back to our browser, yeah, we have it. We have it now to be the way it is meant to look like, purely with HTML, no CSS. So using the internal styling method, like I said earlier, we'll create a style tag within the head section. So here we would have the style. Now within this tag, we can start declaring the elements we want to style. So we want to style the heading 1 element first also. So we'll probably go with the very first, no, the second selector, which is the element selector. So by element selector, you would know that we are going to be referencing the elements by the tag name. So the name of the tag we are, selecting here is heading 1. So you have this to be heading 1, then your curly braces, and then you would assign it a property and a value. So we had the background color to be, okay, let's use blue again. Then you have another property, the font size, let's say 20 pixels, which is still lesser than the heading 1 default font size. And lastly, we would have, I think you would have, yeah, the font family, Korea New, Korea Mono Space. Yes, so if we save this and open with live server now, you see, so from this you can see that the internal CSS works, and it also works the same way, just like the inline method we used previously. So the internal CSS actually works the same way as the inline CSS, but then it doesn't need to appear on the element itself. You can declare it elsewhere, either internally within the style tags within the head section, or externally, that's in a separate CSS file, which we'll look into when we are rounding up for today's class. So let's try to apply some selectors here. So I'm going to have multiple p tags. Just say p. Let's have different names. And the last, I think this should be enough. Yeah. So save this. If we go back to our browser, you would see that they appear the way they are supposed to appear using pure HTML. So we'll be going over the selector. So as we just saw, we use the element selector to style the heading 1 tag, which is selects the elements by the tag name. So now we would use the ID selector. Also, I now remember, yeah, the universal selector, we didn't do that. So let's quickly do that. So if I erase this means that, and I save this means that no element here is styled. So using the universal selector, it has the asterisk and then the curly braces. So let's assume we want the text size. the font size, yeah, font size to be 20 pixels. So now this 20 pixels is going to affect each of the heading tags and each of the paragraph tags, irrespective of the default font size they all have. They are all going to have the same size. It's almost going to look like you can't even tell if this was a heading tag or a paragraph tag before. So if I save this and we open with live server, okay, yeah, they are all the same now. So now the only difference is just the fact that the heading tags are, brighter, that means they are bolder in color, but then every all the tags now are the same. So looking at the first three text, you would know that these are heading text. But peradventure they were not, in bold fonts, they would appear the way the other, elements appear. So you can see that irrespective of the tags, the universal selector affects everything. So the size of this is the same with the size of this. Probably let's use the same amount of text to, make this very, very sure. Let's use welcome to CSS. So we are going to have the same text content in every tag. Okay, you know what? Let me just remove this copy. So if we save this, I'll go back to our browser. Yeah, so this is what the universal selector does. So irrespective of the font size of each of the different headings and the paragraphs, they are going to all have the same size. Now the only difference is that the heading tags maintain their boldness. They are bold by default, that's, as HTML elements, but the paragraph tags are not. But except that using the universal selector will affect every tag. So you can see that the you know the seven elements actually have the same font size. So that's how the universal selector actually works. And if we also add another property to this, let's say background color is green. If we save this, each of these text content we have a background color of green. Oh yeah, so you see, they all have a general background color of green. So that's what the universal selector does. It's actually used, as a general styling for everything. So you probably don't won't be using the selector a lot of times, since you would have different colors, different, arrangements and settings of your HTML document. So let's cancel this. Already we've seen the element selector. So now let's move on to the ID selector. So we are going to have an ID attribute within the p tag. So it will be ID, then with an ID name. So we'll probably just call this paragraph one, but it is short for para one. So we'll save this back to the style. Now, like I said before, we'll start by using the hashtag, then the ID name, para one, and then curly braces. So whatever styling format you have here would only affect, a singular element, because like I said before, you can't have this ID repeated in another element. The moment another element has an ID attribute, it is going to need a different ID name aside from the one that has already been declared. So here we would also have the background color to be red, font family let's use a different second one. We save this, going back to our browser. Yeah, yeah, so you can see that with the id attribute it only affects one element. So the id attribute is very unique and it's meant for just a singular element and not multiple elements. So let's try the class attribute. So delete this. Okay, or probably let's leave it. Let's just create a class attribute still with another p tag. So we have a class equals to para2. We'll save this. Now to use the class attributes, we start with the full stop, then the class name para2, then curly braces, and now we have the property and the color. Background color, let's use blue violet, and let's use a different font family. You see that sand. We save this and go back to our browser. Yes, so now you see that the class and the id attributes are at work but within different elements. Okay. Oh. Mm. Is it working? Oh boy. Hmm. Yes. Oh, oh my god. Okay. Yeah. So we stopped in the CSS class selector. So like I said before, the class selector can be used. I mean, the class attributes can be used within different HTML elements. So if we save this and view on our browser, you can see that the class attributes and the ID attributes are at work in two separate paragraph tags. So we can have multiple class names within different or the same element. So if we have this class name, we copy this class name to the other p tags and also to a heading 1 tag. So if we save and open with live server, yeah, so this is exactly what happened. So the the styling of the class name actually affects every element that has that particular class name. So you can see that the class name can actually be used within different elements, and whichever element has that particular class name attached to it, it's also going to be affected by the styling that was declared. So let's look at the last two selectors. That's the group and the descendant selectors. Before we look into the external CSS, so we'll have ordered list, have list inside. We'll have days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So if we save this, so by using the group selector in the style tags, you're going to have the very first superior element, which is the OL, then followed by the LI. So after this, you have the curly braces, and then you can do your direct styling. So we'll have the font family to be in Arial Helvetica. Also have the background color red. So if we save font live server scroll, yeah, so you can see that each, not each anyway, but the li tags all together have the same background and the same font family. So that's how the group the group selector actually works. So let's see what would happen if we remove the very first superior element. So removing the OL, this might work or it probably might not work. But then I believe the group selector is actually there to do something. So if we save this and go back, okay, it still works in this case. So you can see that either using the group selector or styling it directly, both of them would still work. But then there are some particular instances whereby the group selector is very, very important, probably for some declaration of styling for some particular kinds of elements. So from this, it's very obvious that the UL and the LI might not really be in that category, but then we'll see more of those elements in future classes. So I think the last one we have is the group styling. So like I said before, the group styling is advantageous in the scenario where you are trying to, style different elements but with the same styling format. So rather than repeating the class name or declaring each of these elements with that styling format, you can as well just have them as a group. So we are going to remove these stylings here. Let's remove the class names for each of these. We won't be using them anymore. Yeah. So now we have three p tags that do not have a class or an ID attributes. Also, we have the heading 2 and 3 without, any attributes attached to them. So if we are to style the heading 2 and the heading 3 and these three p tags, we're going to have we're going to use the group selector, which we could use to start with, any tag name. So let's start with the p, also the heading 2 and the heading 3. Okay, so this would also affect even the paragraph that has this ID. So let's just remove the ID to still affect it anyway. So this will be P comma H2 H3. Have the background color green. Every Yeah, so I didn't say this. Every property and value actually ends with this semicolon. So this semicolon is very important in, you know in dividing the properties and the value from each other. So the semicolon should always be at the end of the value. So when you want to start the next property, you would start on a new line and then it wouldn't cause any kind of error. So we change the font family of this to yeah, let's use the first one. Then lastly we would have the font size. So all the paragraph tags with the heading 2 and heading 3 tag would have the same font size, 20 pixels. So if we save this, back to our browser, okay, yeah, so you can see that they are all affected except for the heading 1 tag, and that's because the heading 1 tag wasn't among the um group of tags we selected. So you can see the heading 2, the heading 3 and the paragraph tags, they all have green background and they all have the same font family, also with the same size. Only difference is the heading maintains, its boldness, but the paragraph, well, which doesn't have any boldness, actually remains the same. But besides that, the styling actually affects all of them. So that's how the group, what's it called, selector actually works. So lastly, the external CSS method. So we're going to delete this styling format we use here. So now we are going to have the link tag within the head section. So it starts with the link. First, you would have the relations attributes. This will be style sheet. Like I said before, that's how it is by default for CSS, then the href. So the href specifies the location of the file that is to be linked. So the file we are linking is the style.css, and since we already have that in the same folder with this HTML document, we just need to reference it by the name. So that will be style.css. Okay, you can see it already pops out. So that actually shows that it's within this um folder. Lastly, we would have the type attributes. So this by default for CSS is text slash CSS. So if we save this, nothing happens. But then we'd have to go into the style.css file and actually do the whole, styling. So let's see what we have in the HTML. So we have this class name in the heading 1. So let's, use this. So for the class name, like we said before, we start with a full stop or a dot, then the class name itself. That's yeah, para2. Then with the curly braces, and then you can declare the styling format you want. So the background color would be aqua. Let's use a different font weight. So I think this font weight property actually it increases the boldness of the text. So if we put this on 900, it's going to be a lot more bolder than the way the heading 1 tag is by default. So let's see how it is. Let's see the heading 1 tag, how bold it is by default. So this is how the tag is by default. So now using the font width, let's set it to the highest. I think that's 900. We save this and go back. Okay, it looks okay. So it looks like heading 1 is actually on the highest, boldness. So let's use different property. Let's say font. We use the font family. Change the text. Save, and you'd see a change in the font family of the heading 1. Yeah, so that's it. So that's basically how external CSS work. It works in a separate file, unlike the internal CSS that works within the HTML document by creating a style section inside the head section. So that's how it is for the external CSS. And we can also try other selectors using this external CSS. So let's try the group selector. We'll select the p tag, the heading 2, the heading 3. Background color would be chocolate. You know, font size would be 10 pixels. Let's make it really small. Yeah, so this is, you know, you can see that the style actually affects the HTML elements by using the external CSS method. So the heading 2, the heading 3, and the 4 paragraphs all have the same backgrounds, and they also have the same font size, which is a lot smaller than the default headings for heading 2 and 3. So you can also have as many more selectors within this CSS file. So this CSS file can hold as many much selectors as you want, either the ID selector, the class selector, group, descendant, even the universal selector can also be you know styled within this file. So yes, that's that for CSS. Thank you all, and time for questions and answers.